Hello, and welcome to Top Class, the OECD's education podcast. My name is Marilyn, and I work in the OECD Directorate for Education and Skills. With the release of the results from the latest cycle of the Programme for International Student Assessment, or PISA, you'll no doubt be hearing a lot about which country students perform better or worse than students in other countries. PISA aims to find out how well school systems have prepared students who are near the end of compulsory education to participate fully in society. Each cycle sparks a new global conversation about how to move education forward. But despite the media buzz and education ministers' pronouncements, or maybe because of them, PISA has attracted a fair share of criticism over the years. We invited two education researchers to discuss the strengths and weaknesses of the assessment with Andreas Schleicher, Director of the OECD Directorate for Education and Skills. Dr. Yong Zhao, who joined us by telephone from Beijing, is professor in the School of Education at the University of Kansas. And Dr. Aaron Benavot, who joined us by phone from the U.S., is professor of global education policy in the School of Education at the State University of New York at Albany. Thank you, Andreas, Aaron Benavot, and Yong Zhao for joining us today. Dr. Zhao, I'd like to start with you first. You've pointed out several shortcomings of PISA in your writings. What would you say are your main critiques of PISA?
We are living in the 21st century now. There are so many new different opportunities to rethink, recreate education. But PISA, for that reason, has put out examples like Shanghai, China, and many other East Asian education systems as the high-performing systems. And even though they're high-performing, but they do not necessarily represent the best of education we might need for the 21st century. Sometimes I call it it's a race to the past. Even if everybody did recreate education that as good as Shanghai in 2000, and the world has changed, I think we need perhaps more time, more energy trying to focus on rethinking, creating new education formats, new education possibilities. So I'll just stop there and we can chat more about that.
Andreas, how would you respond?
Well, I think PISA has opened a global dialogue around educational objectives. I've seen the kind of questions Dr. Zhao raises, what knowledge and skills should people learn for the future? It's exactly the dialogue that PISA has enabled. Governments, experts, teachers are working across borders these days to think about those questions. And clearly, PISA not captures not everything that is needed for tomorrow, but it looks at some very important foundations there. Cognitive foundations, problem-solving skills, social skills, some of the social emotional components that are judged to be important. And the question, can we actually test whether those assumptions are true? I think we can. PISA has, through longitudinal studies, that the outcomes that are being measured in a fair number of countries actually do have very strong linkages to students, not only employment outcomes, economic outcomes, but also their well-being, their perception of well-being. So I do think actually, I would agree that certainly PISA doesn't measure everything that is important for success, but it measures some of the ingredients. If people, don't have a weak conceptual understanding of a disciplines, if they do not, are familiar in the world of knowledge, cannot navigate ambiguity, cannot solve complex problems, they're going to have trouble in tomorrow's world as well as today's. So I think that's what PISA is nothing more than that. It's really an enabler of a global dialogue and discussions. We wouldn't actually look at countries like Estonia or Finland or Shanghai today if we wouldn't have had PISA. I mean, that's when the discussion about those countries has really commenced.
Yeah, no, I appreciate very much the PISA set of assumptions that have kind of been built into the platform. I would take issue a little bit with the extent to which there's a real dialogue. There's a commanding voice and the set of publications that go out, and very clear media savvy dissemination of information. I don't think, and which is not to say that in the run up, the many years and months before the actual assessment takes place. There are many experts that get together from different countries, make decisions about what kinds of factors, what kinds of variables are going to be looked at, and how to operationalize them. But these are very internal discussions, and most of them are not something that are very transparent, I think, to scholars and researchers in the field of comparative education, in other educational researchers. So there's a kind of fait accompli that come out. The things are the rankings are put out there. Lots of media attention. But to somehow say that this is part of a global dialogue, I think, is a little bit disingenuous. But I think the deeper point that I would like to make, which goes back to this question about, what kinds of skills and competencies potentially could be valuable as we move into the 21st century. The assumption for most of the international assessments, including PISA, is that these are skills that are somehow it is possible to decontextualize them from, the particular community or society or country in which the skills have been created and sustained and kind of built into, in relationship to a labor market. And the items that are, placed into the PISA assessments are meant to refrain from any reference to a particular context or setting. And so it's built into the DNA of a PISA assessment to see these skills as disembodied, disconnected to the actual context in which not only they've been created, but that they would be adapted or that they would be implemented in different places. So to somehow think that creativity, the same kind of creativity or the same kind of, let's say, perseverance, to say nothing of, let's say, reading skills and maybe numeracy, is equally important and equally valued and equally kind of understood, regardless if you're United States or Germany or in China, in different parts of China and other small places. It's a very bold assumption and I think highly problematic, but it isn't something that it isn't, there's no way to tweak that assumption. Context, cultural traits of a country are not allowed to, in some sense, be part of the mechanism in which the skills are being measured and assessed and ranked. So to somehow think that these decontextualized competencies or skills are necessarily the same ones that are needed across all the different economies that PISA has been applied to is, I think, a problematic assumption.
A quick follow-up to Aaron's point. I think the because of the problematic way of defining what's been measured, and then based on that, we have quite simplistic presentations of results through rankings, and that generates a lot of political interest and general public interest, in a very simplistic way. But then we derive, I think the problem we derive from the so-called high-performing systems, strategies, policies, practices. We invest a lot of money in doing that, and that's actually may not work very well. And another one is, of course, is the checks and balances, the testing driven, all this kind of alliance with centralized curriculum. I think those kind of practices are not necessarily the best in from an education perspective.
I think comparisons are always challenging. It's difficult to compare, to students in the classroom, to classrooms, to schools, to systems, to countries. I think that is certainly, I recognize this. It's always a challenging thing to do. At the very same time as comparisons enable us to learn from each other and learn with each other. And that's really, I think, the driving force between this. I don't see why this is so much more challenging across countries and cultures than it is within countries. Much of the variability that we observe in PISA, in fact, is observed in countries, not between countries. And I think we can measure this. We've also, to take the point that you to further contextualize the metrics, we have done a lot over recent years to make PISA more adaptive, more responsive to the cultural context in countries. Students no longer take exactly the same test, but the test actually adapts to the knowledge and skills of students. The digital delivery, I think, has enabled us to do a lot of this. So I think comparisons are challenging, but also I believe they are a very, very important opportunity for us. And as you rightly say, when you observe some features in a high-performing education system, we never know whether those are the sources of their success, but that's exactly where the kind of discussion and debate can be productive. When I said that PISA enables debate and discussion, actually, you look in the academic literature, how many thousands of articles it has inspired. People write about it. When I see ministers of education meeting these days, and in fact, they meet now with union leaders together. Also, that didn't happen before PISA. There is a dialogue between, government and unions based on a common platform. And yeah, that platform has its limitations. And I also see we need to sort of more to make it more forward-looking, more future-oriented. But for me, it's a starting point. I actually think one of the big problems in education is that everybody considers him or herself totally unique, and that we believe we cannot talk and learn from and with each other because we're different. And I do think we need common languages, common metrics to enable more of a conversation. And certainly, PISA can improve. We do a lot now to make all our instruments available, the whole data set. We do a lot to train researchers on this. We just had, over the last 3 months, a group of experts from the different countries here at the OECD working over several months together to make sense out of their data for their own context. A lot more on this can be done, but I think the idea of having a kind of common language and platform, I believe, is very important.
Well, I think, by the way, I mean, I applaud this opportunity to this perhaps the time that for us to have this conversation and podcast kind of format. I think that's very meaningful. But I mean, I just to get back to say, I would not dispute the importance of kind of talk about data, talk about evidence. But the problem is that if the data itself is quite contrived, is not necessarily represent what we want education, I think that kind of discussion might honestly be a waste of time, and that's actually the other challenge. Like when you were saying, Andreas, that you're talking about to make the testing more culturally responsive, which is antithetical from the PISA definition as a uniform kind of set of skills for all people to be assessed. So I don't think they can actually go together. You make the cultural adaptation, try to fit into the curriculum, the culture of school, of students. I know that's technically possible, but then in that sense, that goes to, I think, against what, in my understanding of the original PISA claim, is that there is a set of not universally applicable set of knowledge predispositions, abilities that would work in all contexts. So going back to Aaron's kind of challenging, I mean, I don't know, you've been to other countries, I've been to many countries. It has an effect, actually, it has seized almost the political energy and other people around the PISA, so which really does not almost allow people to talk about, let's forget about PISA, because PISA now measures. We have those measures. People like competition. They like to be, for all kinds of reasons, to be stand up high on the rankings. So if we accept PISA as the accurate measure of education quality, or not only education quality of today, but also where your youth will be in the future, that's a very powerful statement. I mean, Andreas, if PISA were actually sold as you just described, actually, I don't think it would be a big problem, because you were talking a dialogue, a conversation. But the reality is that it has a lot more power over policymakers, over school leaders than, I think, a simple dialogue starter.
Take my own country, Germany, in 2000, the results came out. Yes, they were very powerful, but they did inspire policymakers and maybe oblige them to do something about it. Germany had huge social disparities in its education systems, was tracking children early. Actually, what has happened is that people have taken those results serious and did something about it. And actually, results have improved. The gap between, immigrant and non-immigrant students that was, phenomenally large, is now half of its size. So yes, that's obviously what you would want, that policymaker get evidence and data in a way that helps them to move forward. This is only one facet in the debate. There are multiple sources. And Dr. Zhao, you ask, PISA is not reflecting the education we want. The problem is that there are more opinions about the education we want than there are people. And all what can PISA do is to bring countries together. There are 80 countries now sitting around the table thinking about precisely this question. What outcomes do we want to be made visible through PISA? And I can tell you those discussions are difficult. They have very different views. Some countries have a very constrained view. It should be only mathematics and science. Other countries see a very broad range of outcomes that should be included in this. And that's a very difficult process among countries. And I also take, Aaron's point serious. We should not have, a single basket of skills that are universally applicable. And that's not the way PISA looks at this. PISA looks actually at the outcomes as a multidimensional kind of phenomenon with a lot of facets there where some countries, some schools, some students may be better on some aspects than others. So looking at outcomes in this kind of multidimensional way is very important. But the debate on, the education we want is a very difficult one. It's very different opinions, and in an international sphere, it's always, I think the answer should not be to drive us to the lowest common denominator. And that's something that PISA has always been clear about. We are not going to be constrained by the lowest common denominator of national curricula. We should be united by what we have in common and where we can see a kind of common future.
Dr. Benavot, I think you wanted to say something?
Yeah, for me, there's a fundamental question, which is, why do we think that OECD is the best arbiter, the best mechanism for having these very important discussions, which I agree with Andreas completely, that many voices, both in government and outside of government, within the education establishment, should be involved in a discussion about what are the ultimate purposes and aims of a national education system or even subnational systems. And the OECD has very clear ideological leanings that are, very neoliberal. It is a place where decisions are being made of a political nature in which, there's a very particular ideological stance of the people determining what is going to be included in the PISA assessment and what is not. And so, if OECD were to be one of several different organizations, international organizations or others that would convene discussions. Now we know UNESCO, for example, has a commission about the future of education, precisely involving people from many different walks of life. So it's clear that these are fundamentally important conversations to have. But in the end, decisions are made, and sometimes the decisions are not neutral, and they are not without biases, and they are not technical or in terms of efficiency, but they have very clear ideological constraints and leanings. The political ramifications of PISA are very important to keep in mind. This is not just a question of constructing evidence and having a discussion about which evidence shows which kinds of aspects of schools are more or less important in affecting change in pupils. The fundamental principles and the ultimate purposes of education do need to be discussed. Even thinking of Finland, probably one of the most important reasons that the Finns have done well over a long period of time is because many different stakeholders in Finland over the course of the 1980s and 1990s came together over an extended period of time to discuss what the Finns wish to see their school system achieve. And once there was a consensus reached, the regime change was much less important in establishing basic reforms that everybody agreed to that would bring the Finnish education system forward. The importance of that building of consensus, of having those conversations, of allowing for many different voices to be heard, and even thinking about how to reflect on diverse and divergent views, I think is fundamental. And I don't think the OECD is the best mechanism through its PISA assessment to do that.
Yeah, my answer to this is actually very simple. The OECD is actually not very central to this whole undertaking. PISA is a collaboration among the countries that take part in this. All decisions are made by the countries that take part. The role of the OECD is, just a moderator, facilitator of this debate. What is being included in PISA is being decided by the countries that take part. And some countries actually decide to go further. For example, this year there's been assessment of global competency, or if some countries choose to do this. So I think this is a member-driven organization. And if PISA were to be done by another organization, you would have a very similar outcomes. I don't think my organization has any direct influence on this, nor is it really that central to the process other than by bringing people together. And I can also tell you, we're not just talking about government here. If you look at the OECD work on the future of education and skills, we have student groups there, we have teacher groups there, we have people from different parts of society, with employers there. And yes, they all have different views and opinions of what the future should be. But again, sharing those views and opinions is something that creates common benefit for all of us. It doesn't mean that we all are going to aim for the same education systems, but being able to see our differences. Where do we set different priorities? Where do we make different choices? Where do we have different values? That kind of frame, in my view, is a very valuable one. And but again, the OECD as an organization is just a facilitator of this.
I want to thank all three of you very much for participating. I thought this was a very interesting and enlightening conversation. And thank you all very much again for joining us and for being here.
Thank you. We hope to have more. Thank you very much. This is great.
If you want to find out more about PISA, please go to www.oecd.org/PISA, P-I-S-A. Follow us on Twitter with the handle @OECD EduSkills. Thanks for listening, and until next time.